Um, Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Greg, for the introduction, and to all of you for really taking time to tune in today. I just want to point out a couple things that I'm really always so honored to meet students as you are pursuing learning more about our healthcare system, and also hoping that I see some of you in the next few years running for office with this knowledge, assuming positions in leadership, both in our city and in our state, because there's so much misinformation that still exists, and people are not really doing the nitty gritty to really figure out what's really affecting and hurting many of our family members, or our neighbors, people that we interact with on a daily basis. So I'm an oncologist by training. I graduated over a long time ago, probably back, many of you were not born yet, but in 1991, I graduated from medical school. And back then, we didn't learn much about healthcare policy. We were always just told that we had the greatest healthcare system in the world. We never really had the types of access to information and data that you have. There was no internet. There was no courses that were really taught in my medical school or even in college. So I think so much of you are so much further along in terms of your knowledge and your learning than I was when I was your age. I went into oncology because I always felt cancer was an area that was something that needed a lot of attention. And initially on, I just was sort of blindly just practicing medicine, really enjoying it. Also being, financially compensated quite well. But what I started to see early on was too many of my own patients who had worked hard their entire lives, done all the right things, when they got cancer, were slowly becoming bankrupt. And in fact, it's now estimated that really 1 out of 3 to maybe half of all people who are diagnosed with cancer in the United States either go bankrupt or have financial ruin, that many times they have to decide whether or not to pay their mortgage or pay for prescription drugs, pay for doctor costs, copays, and deductibles. And as much as I was enjoying my own professional career, it was something that I couldn't stomach and take home and just separate when I went home, seeing these people that were really, really suffering. So about 2 or 3 years into my practice, I really started to explore what was so great about our healthcare system, what was wrong about our healthcare system, and more importantly, what could be done. And over the course of the next several years, became very, very convinced that the current for-profit healthcare system was not only detrimental to patients, but it was really detrimental just to health in general, and started to really begin to advocate for a more comprehensive healthcare system. And along those lines, it was very unusual for somebody who was a specialist to be there. And as I started to become more outspoken, there were a lot of doctors who were very upset for me advocating this way, and even threatened not to refer patients to me because they felt that I was trying to ruin a really great lifestyle for them. But as you all go forward, I would say that it's really important not to take my word for it, not to take somebody from the right or the left's word, but really to just look at the facts and really try to digest and make the right decisions. And then once you learn those things, really share that wealth of knowledge with data to really solve a greater good. So I moved to California about 15 years ago. I grew up in New York and New Jersey, met a girl from Los Angeles who dragged me out to California. I came out here kicking and screaming, but now I'm kind of happy with the choice out here. But one thing that I realized soon, early on, is when I practiced at hospitals like Cedars-Sinai, and I would see somebody who came in the door that was either uninsured or was on Medicaid, or what we call the Medi-Cal, which is the California Medicaid system. As much as I got to spend time with that patient initially to diagnose the problem, when it came time to actually treat the patient, because of Cedars contracts, I was not allowed to. In fact, I had to call around the city to find a doctor that participated in Medicaid or Medi-Cal that would be willing to take this patient. And what I soon found out was that there were very few doctors that participated in the state safety net healthcare system. And in fact, right now, roughly 1 out of 3 people that lives in California is covered by Medi-Cal. So when you think about, we're 40 million people, that roughly 13 million people rely on Medi-Cal, and yet it was so difficult for me to find somebody to take care of these patients. I really started to, again, look into what was wrong with the Medi-Cal system. I soon found out that of all of the 50 states, Medi-Cal, which is a system where the federal government usually pays for half and then the state pays for half, the California had the 48th worst reimbursement, meaning what they paid physicians, hospitals, imaging centers, testing centers. It was 48th out of 50 countries in terms of 50 states in terms of reimbursement. So when you think of the 100,000 people that are, for every 100,000 people here in the state of California, there are only 39 doctors that are willing to see Medi-Cal patients for every 100,000. And so I don't know if you've been paying attention, but over the last probably 2 years, particularly during the pandemic, a lot of articles in the LA Times have been run on how Medi-Cal is this separate and unequal system. And I'm not sure if some of you are covered by Medi-Cal or have family members that are covered by Medi-Cal. The challenge has been getting access. So when you have so few doctors that are willing to see Medi-Cal patients because the reimbursement is so low, and so few hospitals and all of the others, it's this logjam just to try to get in. And sometimes you hear arguments from conservatives that we don't want a government-run healthcare system because we don't want waiting lists like they have in Canada. And I can tell you that we have really bad waiting lists if you have Medi-Cal here in the state of California. So I just want to point a few more things out about the Medi-Cal system, is that in addition to so few providers, whenever I was trying to send my, I'll back up a second. So I left Cedars after that because I really felt like we weren't serving the people that needed it the most. I then soon joined the staff at California Dignity Hospital downtown, where they treat all of the uninsured, they treat all the Medi-Cal patients, because when I was referring patients from Cedars, they were mostly going to California Dignity. And in talking to the doctor down there, he said he was overwhelmed, and if I was ever interested, he would welcome me. So that's how I ended up shifting to California Dignity to take care of Medi-Cal and uninsured patients. Unfortunately, the majority of the patients that we see are from disadvantaged communities of color. Not only once they had developed a tumor, did it take them months to be able to come and see me, but just in terms of getting the necessary medications to control their diabetes, their heart disease, or even just wellness checks, it was very, very difficult. And I'm not sure how much you all are following what our state has been trying to do, or maybe some of your state assembly members or state senators, but you'll see that the fallback measure for our governor and for many of our elected officials is just to say, oh, well, let's just expand Medi-Cal and add more people. And while it sounds great that there's been an emphasis to cover our undocumented brothers and sisters, and I applaud that, what they've done is just add additional 250, 300,000 people to a system that's already got too few providers. So all you've done is add more people to the mix and not enough incentive for more people to take care of them. So, my hope, and as a result of that, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund has decided to sue the state of California. Matter of fact, they sued the state of California 3 years ago, claiming that the Medi-Cal system was an apartheid, separate and unequal system. The state fought it, but now a judge has recently ruled in favor of letting the lawsuit move forward. And my hope is that it will finally force the state to put more money into the system to attract more hospitals and doctors and networks so that we don't have this second class tier system. So one of the things I would ask each of you to do as you pursue your study is to learn more about this system, because it does affect 1 out of 3 people here in the state of California. And it really affects the communities that don't tend to have a voice. And I think that the other part that I mentioned, that Greg mentioned, is that I'm very active politically, and really have been active in fighting for whether it be Medicare for all, whether it be immigrant rights, whether it be criminal justice reform. I've really tried to not just limit my advocacy and work in healthcare, but really trying to solve a common good. And when you look at health, it is so absolutely crucial to our, making sure that we as a society are functioning really, really well. So I would encourage you all to really learn more about it and get involved in the fight. If you all have ever had a chance to go and meet your state assembly person or your state senator or even members of Congress, I would really ask you to bring attention to this, because I view the Medi-Cal system as sort of like people sweeping it under the rug. They feel better, wow, I'm doing something, but none of them really takes the time to understand the implications of how crappy the healthcare system is that they're putting people on. And unfortunately, you have a lot of members of Congress, a lot of members of the state assembly and state senate who are beholden to the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and will continue to do the bidding that's favorable to them rather than serving their constituents. And the last thing I will just add is that about 5 years ago, I got into trouble. I was speaking at a Bernie Sanders rally in New York, and I used an insensitive term to refer to members of Congress who were bought and beholden by the pharmaceutical industry and insurance industry as the reason we would never get the type of real healthcare we deserved for our communities and for the people that needed it the most. And while I apologize for using the term, I think the facts have continued to show that we do have an elected group, too many elected officials that remain bought and will not speak out on behalf, do the right thing for us. So I hope that each and every one of you will use your knowledge to continue to educate your family members, your neighbors, your communities, so that people finally rise up and demand the real type of healthcare that they deserve. But the first area I would say that we could work collectively, it's going to take a long time to get a Medicare for all system. But I think in the short term, what we could do is demand more reimbursement for Medi-Cal so that we could get more providers and hospitals and everyone to participate. And in doing so, then people wouldn't have the poor access to care that they have right now.
This is good. Dr. Song, let me stop you for a second here, because I want to move this to a bit more of a discussion phase here. We're asking a lot of you to cover a lot of different topics. But, one thing that really stands out to me as a challenge is getting people comfortable with the idea of change. And a question came up actually by someone who just put a message in the chat here last time about, why it's so hard to make a change. And so you were talking about, politicians sort of being in the pocket of big industry like insurance groups and pharmaceutical companies. But is that the only thing in your view that's really stopping us? Or would you like to maybe talk a little bit about that, more about what some of the challenges are? But then also, like, if it's not just money, are there other things that you see that kind of prevent us from being comfortable with change or pursuing change?
Yes, I think it's ignorance, it's lack of real knowledge. And that's why I'm so grateful to all of your students here that as they learn, they can share what the real facts are. So, I think when you try to really explain what a Medicare for all system is or expanding Medi-Cal, it goes over the average person's head. And many times the opposition who gets their talking points from the pharmaceutical industry or the insurance industry, whose best interest is to maintain the status quo, it's hard to tell who's speaking truth and who's not. And that's why I believe in some respects, the more people get educated like this group here, and the more they can just, even around the kitchen table, be able to say, no, that's not the truth. Here's what the big problems are. We can bring about a greater sense of change, because we've tried here in the state of California to really bring about a grassroots movement to demand the type of healthcare that we really deserve. Just to put it in perspective, for every healthcare dollar that is spent here in the state of California, a group from UCLA found that 70 cents of every healthcare dollar is paid for already by us, the taxpayers, both in terms of giving tax breaks to Apple and Google to provide healthcare for their employees, all of the healthcare that's provided to the state employees, our teachers, our firefighters, and then everything that we have to pay out of pocket, whether it be all of our co-pays and deductibles. If you add up all of that money, 70 cents of every healthcare dollar is already paid for by us. And then if you look at the amount of money that's skimmed from the healthcare system by the private insurance industry, by not being able to negotiate drug prices, we were essentially paying for a healthcare system where we could insure everyone at the same high quality. But because Kaiser and United Healthcare, Blue Shield, and all of these big players in our states, if you look, they are some of the largest donors in the state, both in terms of to the elected officials as well as the Democratic Party. They make sure that no legislation is ever passed that will really make it what's in the best interest of us. So I think it's a combination of lack of knowledge. I think it's a lot of money that's spent against us, as well as the overall ignorance of the general electorate to really know what the real facts are. People throw out, oh, we don't want socialized medicine, we don't want a government takeover. But I will tell you that hopefully you guys are all young enough that you haven't had to access the healthcare system. But God forbid you or your family member does get sick, you will see it's not the government that gets between you and your doctor. It's constantly the insurance industry that's telling me what drugs I can prescribe, where I can send the patient. It's telling you what doctors you can see, who's in your network, what's in your network. And the idea that the government would take away your choice of seeing a doctor, just to put in perspective, most of you, if you have private insurance right now, are in an insurance plan that has what we call a narrow network, meaning that within your given area, you're only able to see 25% or less of all the doctors in your area because the insurance company that you have has failed to negotiate a contract with all 100% of the doctors. So all of the things that maybe you've been told that a government plan will do, limit choice, limit accessibility, you're already in a system like that. I'll just stop there and answer that question.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. And I just want to give everyone a heads up too, that we're going to have a time for discussion with Dr. Songa and with myself in a small group setting after this. So we're not taking questions right at this moment, but I suspect you've got a number of burning ones. I became aware of your work, Dr. Song, when I was following AB 1400, a bill here in California to expand single payer. And so for those of you who are on this right now, on this call, that don't know what single payer is, it's the idea of there being sort of one payer for healthcare for individuals. And usually that refers to the government. So in California, we had this bill recently that really, I think, came out of many years of similar types of bills. But I became aware of your work because you've been a big speaker on these issues, and were asked to comment in a number of forums, and I really found your comments interesting. But when you and I had a conversation preparing for this, you gave me some insight that I didn't quite have from an outsider's perspective, which was that you felt like this bill was doomed from the start. Would you mind, in the simplest terms you can do it, for this group here, because not everybody may be familiar with single payer, but what happened with that bill? And I'm mostly interested in not the inner workings of the bill, but really sort of the politics behind it, the best you could describe it.
So the governor ran as a one of the things he was going to do was implement single payer. Now, other states have tried it, like Vermont, but Vermont only has a population of 500,000. But whereas California has a population of 40 million, we're the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world at any given time. So if any place could do it, it would be California. So the governor campaigned as being an advocate of single payer, that he was going to push this through. Now, when he was elected, President Trump was president. So you would have to get a federal waiver, so he could speak a big game, but knowing in the end, Trump would never allow him to do that. So now fast forward a couple of years later, we have President Biden, who is not a big fan of single payer, but his Health and Human Service Secretary, Javier Becerra, has always been in favor of single payer and would certainly be willing to give the state of California a waiver to implement its own healthcare system. So what happened was the governor all of a sudden was silent. He was mute. He didn't say one thing or another. When asked by the press, he said, "Oh, I haven't had a chance to look at it." And you have to realize the governor is somebody who is one of the most savvy politicians, who's a policy wonk, who really knows what's going on. But for him to say, I haven't had a chance to read it, is really disingenuous, particularly given he campaigned on this. So without the governor sort of shepherding it and leading it, it was left to a very nice but relatively unknown state assembly person from San Jose, Ash Kalra, to try to push this bill forward. And initially, no one thought it would get through the health committee. No one thought it would get through the various steps of the assembly. But what happened was this incredible grassroots movement of thousands of dedicated activists did something unprecedented. They used social media. They got constituents from for the 15 members of the State Assembly Committee, they targeted each of them, got constituents from each of their neighborhoods to post why they needed this bill, because they had, and shared their personal health struggles. And lo and behold, the pressure got so bad on many of these people that we never ever expected to allow it to move forward, that they said reluctantly, "I'll move it forward." And it exceeded expectation as far as how far it went. But when it got to the assembly, that's when people were like, for a full vote, that's where it really got serious. And it became clear that a lot of those people that voted for it in the little committees had no intention of voting it for in the assembly. And again, partially, if you look at the donations, who they got their donations from, it was primarily the insurance industry, pharmaceutical industry. So it became clear that the votes were never there. So the reason I said to you that I never expected this to pass is, in the end, this is a Herculean task that requires leadership, and it has to come from the governor. And if the governor is not going to lead this, he's not going to wrangle people from both the House and Senate to that. If you remember with the Obamacare, President Obama, he had a supermajority in the House and Senate, but he barely passed the Affordable Care Act. And again, if you look at the Affordable Care Act, leading up to it, there were 3,300 registered healthcare lobbyists for 535 members of Congress. So there are roughly 6 lobbyists for 1 member of Congress. And more was spent per day, $1.2 million per day. And in total, more was spent lobbying Congress than was spent on the Bush-Kerry presidential election. And that's why, while the Affordable Care Act sounds great, it never had any insurance rate regulation. It never had any pharmaceutical drug pricing control, because the members of Congress, remember, it was a supermajority, you would have felt this was a slam dunk to get through, were so beholden to these special interests.
Students often ask me for input about why single payer, why universal healthcare can't seem to get off the ground anywhere. And I know there have been efforts in Vermont and in Colorado, I believe. I think maybe in the 80s, there was something in Hawaii that was debated. I might be sort of mixing up my story there. But it's always struck me that in a country as diverse as ours, that we would need to start this in the way that Canada did, that it would begin in a province or begin in one state, and it would set the tone. Of course, I think if it passed in like California, if we could get something off the ground in California, it would almost like prove the case that this could be done, because California is so large. Mm-hmm. But now that I think about it a bit more, and after listening to you, I kind of wonder if maybe this would be something just to try in a smaller state. Like that would be a more manageable place to try something out. What do you think?
So the problem of that is Vermont had tried it, and they only have a population of 500,000. And because of the close proximity to Massachusetts on one side and New York, a lot of the people who lived in Vermont would commute every day to Massachusetts or to New York for work, and they got their coverage through their employers in those states. Then you take into account the number of military personnel who were getting coverage through a couple military bases there. So out of that 500,000, it was even less. And just to point out, the whole idea behind single payer is not to control, it's not socialized medicine. So socialized medicine, just so let's be clear, is when the government owns and operates every aspect of the healthcare system. They own the hospitals, they own the radiology centers, the labs, the pharmacies, and every single person who works in those departments is employed by the government. And ironically, we have a socialized healthcare system that takes care of our military that fights for our freedom. And it's so ironic that, you hear this term socialism bandied about like it's so bad and it's not against freedom, yet the people that fight for our freedom are covered by a socialized healthcare system. That is not what AB 1400 was. A single payer system, just to be clear, it's taking all the money that we normally spend on healthcare. So instead of Apple having to pay for healthcare for employees, it just pays a little bit tax, and that money goes into a pool. All the money that's used to pay for Medicare, Medicaid, all of the other healthcare programs goes into the pool. Instead of us paying premiums, there's a small percentage that's taken from our paycheck based on our ability to pay. If you don't make much, or you don't have to pay anything basically at all. And it's really puts more onus on the more successful that really should be able to afford it. And the idea is you take all that money. Now that's one part, right? And part of the reason that our healthcare system is so expensive is you have so many different payers. So if one of you maybe is getting coverage this year through your parents' plan because you're under 26, but next year you turn 27 and now you got to get healthcare from United Healthcare. And maybe the next year you get a new job and you have to get your job health insurance through Aetna. When you go to a doctor, that doctor's got to figure out, am I in your plan? If so, what's your copay? What's your deductible? And all of that complexity and constant figuring things out takes money away from actual taking care of patients and goes towards what we call administrative waste. So a single payer system does several things. One, it eliminates all that single payer, that administrative complexity and waste. So regardless of what age you are, what job you have, whether or not you're employed or not, whether or not you have pre-existing conditions or not, you will always have that same insurance and that freedom that wherever you move to, wherever you go, it's still the same coverage that you have no matter what. So that's one. The second thing is you save all the money from the administrative because it becomes simpler dealing with knowing that it's just one source that's going to pay for it. So if I'm a doctor, I don't have to hire all these people to fight with insurance companies to figure out who's being, whether or not I can get billed. It's much simpler, so I can actually spend more time with patients rather than more time fighting with insurance companies, have to spend less time on administrative costs. And then the other part, Greg, that really is important with a small market, 250,000 people. So let's say Vermont has that and you whittle it down to 250,000. It's hard to negotiate discounts with just a small population. But if you take 40 million people, you use that total combined market share, you can negotiate deep discounts in drugs. You can negotiate deep discounts in the cost of a Band-Aid. Why is it you go to Cedars and they charge you $75 for a Tylenol? Guess what? If 40 million people said, you know what, we're not going to pay that, you make it cheaper, all of those savings will then go to make sure that we take care of all those people who are not insured and we bring everyone up to a higher standard. So you save administrative savings, you use the sheer market size to negotiate deep discounts. But on the other side of the providers, if you're a hospital, you don't have to worry about justifying, I have to charge $75 because for the uninsured people I take care of and the money I lose. Everyone has an insurance that will make sure that the hospitals, they may not be able to gouge as much as they do right now, but they will never lose money for taking care of somebody who doesn't have coverage. So that's the idea behind a single payer system. Now, one thing that's really important to realize is prior to Bernie running in 2016, the majority of the nation never heard of single payer or Medicare for all ever. But if you look at between 2016, his first run, and now, more than 50% of Americans, and here in the state of California, it was like greater than 80% of all Democrats support a single payer system. So now all of a sudden everyone's heard about it and everyone's noticed about it and knows about it. And even if you look at independents and some Republicans, the majority of Americans now support Medicare for all. And if you look at the curve of marriage equality, which is something my wife and I worked very hard to fight against the bigotry and all of that. But if you look 2 years before marriage equality became the law of the land, and you look at that curve, as well as you look at the curve for Medicare for all the last several years, the curves almost mirror itself. 2 years prior to Prop 8 here in California, the majority of Californians were against marriage equality, but in a short period of time, the overwhelming majority came in to support that. And what happened? Many of my friends came out to their family members, came out to their coworkers, came out to their neighbors, and people started to humanize people who wanted to have the same rights that they did. And that's what I think is important to the healthcare movement. People need to humanize and share how the current healthcare system is continuously screwing them over, and how they all aspire for something greater. So I think there's a lot we can learn, not so much from the state by state with Saskatchewan, which I think with regard to California, potentially that could happen, but also in terms of how the marriage equality fight was won in here in the state of California.
It does seem like it has to be a culture change, like you're describing. The book actually that we're doing these activities around called Healthcare Revolt. I don't know if it'll show up with my background here, but it's not a single payer book. It's not arguing necessarily for a single payer system. What it is arguing for is single payer primary care, making sure that everybody has, at least that basic access to primary care covered through some type of universal system. And then the argument is that perhaps the specialized care wouldn't be quite as expensive. You wouldn't have to pay quite as much for insurance to cover that. I'm not personally sure that that's the best route to go either. But let me ask you, if you don't mind, a challenging question, which is, and it's not something we discussed in advance, so I'm sorry throwing you for a loop here maybe, but is what do you worry about with the single payer system? Like we've talked about the pros, but there's got to be some potential cons, and maybe it's always good to be a little bit upfront about that.
So I've always been clear that I don't think there's any perfect healthcare system. Certainly the people will look at problems in Canada as a reason why we shouldn't have it. But just to be clear, Korea, Taiwan have very successful single payer systems that are better funded per person than the Canadian system. So I think when people like to use Canada as the example of why it's not working compared to, say, Korea or Taiwan, I think they need to look at all those systems. But having, are there limitations to a single payer system? Sure. I think that in Korea, I know some people who get really advanced cancer after they've had 3-4 different treatments. Here in the US, if you have the means, you can still continue to do exhaustive therapy, even if it's got very little benefit. But in systems like that, after 3 or 4 things, they really just follow the data and they're like, nothing is really going to work for you. And patients sometimes are denied. But I think the most important thing to realize is Canada, Korea, Taiwan, they put a much higher premium on preventative care and early stage access. Right now, if you have to pay $50 copay every time you go to see a doctor, or you have one of these really crappy, what we call bronze plans that have a $7,800 to $8,000 deductible, that means the first bit of money that comes out of any care you see in a calendar year, it comes out of your own pocket. And most people don't have $7,000 to $8,000 sitting around in their pockets, or even $50. So our system, the idea that I want to give people universal care is what a typical politician who doesn't like Medicare for all says. Having an insurance card that has a high deductible or copay doesn't mean you actually have access to care. And that's the first thing I would say with these systems. They give you access to care. The second part is I've never seen anyone in any of these countries go bankrupt because they've gotten sick. And that's the other part that is really, really awful here in this, in our country, that we have so many people that go bankrupt. And what's even more criminal about our Medi-Cal system is there's something called a clawback, that let's say your mom is on, Medi-Cal and she dies, but then there's an estate, like she sells her small little house that, she lived in for 50 years that isn't worth much. The state can claim some of that money back from the sale of her house. Talk about continuing generational poverty rather than allowing the people that need it the most to move ahead. So I think that I'm never to say that a Medicare for all system is perfect, but I think as far as giving everyone equal access to care and preventing you from going bankrupt, no other system can guarantee that.
No. This has been a fantastic conversation, Dr. Song. I got to express deep gratitude to you for taking the time to be a part of this with us today. And I'm not letting you go yet. You need to, hopefully you'll stick around with us for a little bit of the book discussion that I know the Public Health Student Association is going to do. And then we're going to move to small breakout groups where I think you can have a bit more one-on-one interaction. And I just want to put it out there for folks. We have a guest, a surprise guest at the end of this session today, so stick around. And if you wouldn't mind, everyone, this has become a little bit of a habit here, but I'd like to take a group photo just to